Every community remembers its beginnings in different ways. Some preserve them in books. Others carve them into stone. Across Monday, many of the oldest memories were carried in the voices of griots. They preserve the histories of families, kingdoms, and great events, passing them from one generation to the next. Long before many of these stories were written down, they lived in memory. Among them was the story of a boy named Sundiata Keita. Today, Sundiata is remembered as the founder of the Mali Empire. Yet the story of his early life comes to us in different ways. Much of what people know is preserved in the Epic of Sundiata, one of West Africa's great oral traditions. Later written accounts by historians, together with archaeological evidence and modern scholarship, help us understand the broader historical setting. Together, they offer a picture that is both rich and incomplete. The epic tells of a time when the kingdoms of Monday were divided, and when the future of the region had not yet been decided. It remembers Sundiata's birth as part of a larger story about leadership, destiny, and the founding of an empire. Like many oral traditions, it combines history with symbolism, preserving not only events, but also the values of the people who passed the story from one generation to the next. Historians approach these traditions with care. They recognize the epic as an invaluable historical source, not because every detail can be confirmed, but because it preserves memories that written records alone cannot provide. By comparing oral tradition with later written accounts and other forms of evidence, historians continue to learn about the world in which Sundiata lived. That world was changing. Across Monday, rulers governed independent kingdoms linked by trade, family ties, and shared traditions. Farmers worked the land through the changing seasons. Hunters entered the forest before sunrise. Traders crossed long distances carrying gold, salt, cloth, and news from places many would never see for themselves. Children were born into this world every day. Most would grow up to live lives remembered only by their families and communities. One child, however, would be remembered for centuries. Not because people wrote about him during his lifetime, but because generation after generation chose not to let his story be forgotten. The next part of that story has become one of the best-known traditions in West African history. It tells of a child whose early years did not unfold as others expected. A memory that has endured for more than 700 years. Chapter 2. Growing Up Different. One of the most enduring memories of Sundiata's childhood comes from the Epic of Sundiata. According to the oral tradition preserved by griots, Sundiata did not walk during the early years of his life. While other children learned to stand and run, he remained unable to walk. The story has been passed down for centuries, and is one of the best-known parts of the epic. Historians cannot confirm whether this account is literally true. No written record from Sundiata's lifetime survives to describe his childhood. What we know comes largely from oral tradition, recorded centuries later by griots whose role was to preserve the memory of the past. For that reason, historians treat this story as an important part of Monday cultural memory, while recognizing that some details cannot be verified, whether understood as history, symbolism, or both. The story has endured because of what it represents. Across many cultures, stories of remarkable leaders often begin with unexpected hardship. They remind listeners that greatness is not always easy to recognize in its earliest days. In Monday, the story of Sundiata's childhood became part of a larger tradition about resilience, leadership, and perseverance. The epic also remembers the people closest to him. His father is remembered as Magon Konfata, a ruler of the Monday kingdom of Niani. His mother is remembered as Sogolene Keju, whose place in the tradition remains central to the story of Sundiata's early life. Like much of the epic, these accounts are preserved through oral tradition. They form an essential part of Monday history, even as historians continue to examine which elements can be confirmed through other evidence. Beyond the royal household, life continued much as it always had. The rain still marked the seasons. Farmers watched their crops grow. Hunters followed familiar paths through the woodland. Markets filled with traders carrying goods from neighboring kingdoms and from lands far beyond the Sahara. To those living through those years, the future remained uncertain. No one could know which children would become farmers, traders, hunters, or leaders. Time alone would reveal the paths their lives would take. For the child remembered in the epic, those early years became the foundation of a story that would be told for generations. According to the tradition, the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The peace of childhood would give way to political struggle. Before Sundiata could become the leader remembered in history, he would first lose the home where his story began. Chapter 3. Years away from home. Every story of exile begins with a place left behind. For Sundiata, the traditions of Monday remember that place as home. They also remember a time when the stability of his family came to an end. Much of what follows comes from the Epic of Sundiata, where the events surrounding his exile are described in detail. Historians agree that Sundiata was associated with a period of political struggle before the rise of the Mali Empire. The sequence of events, the people involved, and the reasons for his exile, however, cannot all be confirmed from contemporary written evidence. According to the epic, Sundiata's father died while Sundiata was still young. After his death, leadership passed to another ruler. As power shifted, Sundiata, his mother Sogolen Keju, and members of their family left Monday and sought refuge in other kingdoms. The epic remembers these years as a time of wandering. Different versions of the tradition describe the family finding protection in several courts across West Africa. These journeys introduced Sundiata to lands beyond his birthplace and brought him into contact with rulers whose alliances would later become important. Historians cannot trace every step of these travels. What they can say with greater confidence is that alliances between neighboring kingdoms played an important role in the politics of 13th century West Africa. Leaders depended on relationships that extended beyond their own borders, and support from neighboring rulers could determine whether a kingdom survived a time of crisis. While Sundiata and his family lived away from Monday, life continued in the homeland they had left behind. The fields were still planted with each rainy season. Traders still crossed the region carrying gold, salt, cloth, and news. Griots continued to preserve the histories of families and kingdoms, adding each new generation to the stories they carried. But the political landscape was changing. The influence of Sumaworo Kante continued to grow. More communities came under the authority of the Soso kingdom, and resistance became increasingly difficult for rulers who stood alone. Across Monday, the desire for stability grew stronger. Whether remembered through oral tradition or reconstructed through historical research, one point is clear. The region was moving toward a decisive moment. The divisions among the Monday kingdoms could not continue forever. The years of exile would not be the end of Sundiata's story. According to both historical tradition and scholarly consensus, they became the years that led to his return. And when that return came, it would not be for one family alone. It would become part of the story of an entire people. Chapter 4. The Return. Years had passed since Sundiata left Monday. The kingdoms he had known as a child were no longer the same. Across the region, the influence of the Soso kingdom had continued to grow, and many communities faced a future shaped by new political realities. It was during this period that the story preserved by the griots and the conclusions reached by many historians begin to move closer together. The Epic of Sundiata tells that messengers traveled in search of Sundiata, asking him to return to Monday. They came because many believed the divided kingdoms could no longer face the growing power of Soso alone. While historians cannot verify every detail of these accounts, they broadly agree that Sundiata emerged as the leader of a coalition of Monday rulers during the early 13th century. His return was not simply the journey of one man. It reflected a larger change taking place across the region. Kingdoms that had often acted independently began to recognize that their future might depend on cooperation. Long-standing rivalries became less important than the shared challenge before them. Building such an alliance was no small task. Each ruler had responsibilities to their own people. Every kingdom had its own customs, leaders, and interests. Bringing them together required agreement on a common purpose. Even if they did not agree on everything else. This moment would become one of the defining turning points in the history of Monday. The traditions preserved by griots remember Sundiata as the leader who united these kingdoms. Historians, while careful about the details preserved in oral tradition, also recognize his central role in the coalition that challenged the Soso kingdom. Across the region, ordinary life continued. Markets still opened with the rising sun. Farmers worked their fields. Hunters followed familiar trails through the woodland. Yet beneath these familiar routines, something had changed. For the first time in many years, there was the possibility that the kingdoms of Monday might act together instead of apart. That hope would soon be tested. The coalition led by Sundiata would meet the forces of Sundiata Keita in a battle remembered across centuries. Its outcome would shape not only the future of Sundiata, but also the future of West Africa. The boy remembered in the traditions of Monday had returned. The leader remembered by history was about to emerge. Chapter 5. The leader who united Monday. When Sundiata returned, he returned to a land that had changed. The kingdoms of Monday had spent years facing growing pressure from the Soso kingdom. Many had fought alone. Now, they faced a choice that would shape their future: remain divided or stand together. Historians broadly agree that Sundiata became the leader of a coalition of Monday rulers. Together, they challenged the authority of Sundiata Keita in a conflict that reached its turning point at the Battle of Kirina. Much about the battle remains uncertain. The exact year is still debated. The size of the armies is unknown. The Epic of Sundiata describes dramatic events and heroic deeds that have become part of Monday's cultural memory, while historians rely on later written accounts and other evidence to reconstruct what can be established with confidence. What is not in doubt is the outcome. The coalition led by Sundiata defeated the Soso kingdom. That victory changed the course of West African history. For the people of Monday, its importance was felt long after the fighting ended. Safer trade routes allowed merchants to travel with greater confidence. Farmers worked in a region that was becoming more stable. Local rulers who had once acted alone became part of a larger political community. The work of building that community did not end with victory. According to Monday oral tradition, leaders met after the conflict to establish principles for governing the new state. These traditions are often associated with the Kurukan Fuga, remembered as one of the earliest constitutional charters in the region. Historians continue to debate its exact origins and how closely the surviving versions reflect the 13th century. But they agree that the tradition expresses enduring ideas about leadership, justice, and shared responsibility. The empire that emerged under Sundiata did not depend on one person alone. It relied on farmers who produced food, artisans who shaped tools, merchants who connected distant markets, griots who preserved memory, and local leaders who governed their communities. Their work gave lasting strength to what had begun as an alliance. Sundiata's place in history rests not only on winning a battle. It rests on helping to create a political order that endured beyond his lifetime. His story had become larger than the story of one man. It had become part of the story of a people building a new future together. Yet history remembers leaders in different ways. Some are remembered through monuments, some through written records. Sundiata would be remembered above all through memory itself. A memory carried from one generation to the next, long before it reached the pages of history. Chapter 6. The Man, the Memory, and the Empire. History remembers Sundiata Keita in two ways. One is found in the work of historians. The other lives in the voices of the griots. Neither tells the whole story alone. The written record is limited. No account from Sundiata's own lifetime has survived. Much of what historians know comes from later writers such as Ibn Khaldun, who wrote more than a century after Sundiata's death. Together with archaeology, linguistics, and the study of West Africa's oral traditions. The griots preserved something different. They carried a memory that was never meant to be a simple list of dates or battles. The Epic of Sundiata preserved the values of the Monday people. The importance of courage, loyalty, unity, wise leadership, and keeping the past alive through storytelling. For centuries, these stories were spoken, not written. Each generation learned them from the one before. Each griot became both a storyteller and a guardian of memory. That is why Sundiata's story has endured for more than 700 years. Not because every detail can be proven, but because generations believed it was too important to lose. Historians continue to study where memory and evidence meet. They compare the epic with medieval Arabic writings. They examine archaeological discoveries. They study ancient trade routes, settlements, and languages. With every new discovery, the picture becomes a little clearer. Even as some questions remain unanswered. Those unanswered questions are part of history. They remind us that the past is not always complete. Sometimes history survives in stone. Sometimes it survives in ink. And sometimes it survives because people refuse to forget. The Mali Empire would continue to grow after Sundiata's lifetime. Future rulers expanded its influence across West Africa. Its merchants carried gold across the Sahara. Its scholars helped make cities like Timbuktu renowned for learning. Its name reached travelers from North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. But none of that explains why Sundiata is still remembered today. His story endures because it marks the beginning. The beginning of an empire. The beginning of a tradition of leadership remembered across generations. And the beginning of one of Africa's greatest historical legacies. At the African Archive, we remember Sundiata not because every question has been answered. We remember him because his story shows how history is preserved. Sometimes through evidence. Sometimes through memory. And most often, through both. Before there was an empire known across the world, there was a story carried from one voice to another. That story is still being told. Thanks for staying with us this far. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.